All right, it's time now to talk about extreme programming. Extreme programming was created by Kent Beck. Kent Beck has done a huge amount in the world of software engineering and actually in lots of things. But notable was work on patterns, primarily talking about small talk, but other sorts of patterns as well. So these are design patterns. He's one of the originators back for X unit, which became J unit. It's what almost all of our unit testing frameworks are based on and look like now. So the unit testing that you're doing with Ruby and Rails and Minitest is all descendant and takes as inspiration the unit testing work that he did. And he's also, he just call, he's the rediscoverer of test-driven development. I would think a lot of people would just call him the person who did test-driven development. He's the person who's written the book on it and promoted it and so forth. And these sorts of things you'll see are embedded inside of extreme programming. Extreme programming, I'm going to cover the material I'm going to cover comes largely from his book that he wrote with Cynthia Andres in 2004, Extreme Programming Explained. This is the second edition. There was a first edition in 1999, so that tells you how soon, following the Agile Manifesto, of which he's one of the signers, one of the original people as part of the Agile Manifesto, he wrote this. And apparently, I haven't looked at this book, but apparently the first edition doesn't make much sense to people. So he got some help and wrote a new version in 2004 that made a lot more sense. Also material I'll talk about today with regard to extreme programming also is informed by reading in this book, Learning Agile by Stellman and Green from 2014. Of interesting note, it's Stellman and Green who wrote that nice book that I said back in, I think, 2005 or so, that really sort of the pinnacle of practices for waterfall. So I think they're very good authors. In 10 years from when they last were saying this is the way that you do software development, they were saying, well, let's show you Agile now because it's actually the way to do things. So yes, when they were writing their waterfall book, Kent Beck was writing and publishing his Agile book on extreme programming. It's probably named partly from the time period when I think extreme sports came on the scene. It certainly was a notion of sort of a radical notion of how to do software. I think XP is a better name than extreme programming. Anyways, let's not let the name detract from the value of what we have here. Like Scrum, a really important part of extreme programming is that it starts with a set of values. Now, Kent Beck lays this out that you have to have these values, and they'll act as a philosophy of the software and the work that you do. You'll have concrete practices. And so this might be like a test first development. We're going to write our tests first, and that's a practice. And we can spell it out and you can do it. Whereas a value is sort of a high level thing. It's like, well, I just have to believe this and follow this. Tying the two together, he talks about principles. It's totally clear to me how to distinguish between the values and principles at times, but this is how he presents it. I think that's a nice thing is the values. There's 5 major values. And this sort of gives you a whole set of principles that sort of are derived from those values. It's a bit more concrete down to these are very concrete actions to take. Now, Scrum, which we've been using in 342, also has values. And we've talked about them. You may have forgotten about them by now, but some of the really big ones there in Scrum are that we have this notion of collective commitment, that we work as this team, we're all in it together. And also the team is self-organizing. There's no de facto leader. We're going to work together as a team, but we are going to be, as individuals, take responsibility, and we're going to self-organize our team and manage it. One of the things that's interesting, I think one of the things, big distinctions in my mind between what we'll talk about today with extreme programming and Scrum is that with Scrum, there's so many, the process is so detailed, where we, with all of our planning, our daily stand-up, our review, our retrospective, the fact that we time box our sprints, we have all these sort of things in play that I think it's pretty easy for teams going from waterfall to go to Scrum. It seems very practice based. And sure, yeah, we've got some principles or values that we should follow. But even if you're not fully into that, I think you'll still get a win from taking Scrum over waterfall. Now, you're not going to get the big win out of Scrum until you really follow all of the values. And you may be seeing this already on your teams. Team members who aren't really committed to this notion of we're a collective as a team and we're helping each other and working together, you can tell it's dragging down. You kind of end up wishing that there was a boss or a manager to tell that person what to do, get that person to work. And you can see that it requires buy-in for it to be really effective, that everyone has to buy in that, oh yeah, we're in this together, but also we're going to self-organize. And self-organizing means also I take on individual responsibility in things. In contrast, XP has, I feel, it's certainly got lots of practices, but they feel a lot less explicit process-oriented wise. And I think or at least Kent Beck didn't spell them out as explicitly as things in Scrum have over the years become explicitly spelled out. And I think that means that there's actually a large amount of the value with extreme programming comes from paying attention to its values and principles. And what can we learn from that? And in fact, I would say that, there's sort of this spectrum where we go from waterfall to Scrum, which could almost be seen as sort of doing a whole bunch of tiny little waterfalls, but that allows us to change. It allows us to adapt and learn. There's all sorts of huge things that are there that aren't present in waterfall, or at least the iteration cycle for waterfall is so great that we don't really see as great a value there. Then, actually, we haven't talked about it yet, but we'll get to it, talking about Kanban. I think Kanban's kind of like the next step after Scrum. What about extreme programming? I think extreme programming sort of permeates all of Agile. And so understanding extreme programming, I think, is almost more important for you to go, oh, there's a whole set of stuff here, thinking about how do we work as teams, and that can show up in whether we're doing Scrum, whether we're doing Kanban, or whether you call yourself an extreme programming team. And so I think probably the biggest impact from extreme programming has largely probably been the way that it has set people's mental models for approaching Agile software. And you're going to see a lot of stuff here that shows up in the other Agile forms, and it would have originated in extreme programming, especially given its date. Now Scrum was coming up around then as well. There's all these things coming out of the Agile movement. But I think Ken Beck has got a really good perspective, and let's start talking about that. All right. So, we start with values, then we'll go to principles, and then we'll get into the practices. All right. So XP's philosophy, and he actually, Ken Beck calls this, of software development. All right. Um, is basically, it's based on a set of 5 values. Some things from the book that he says, for example, values bring purpose to practices. So in other words, he uses this example repeatedly. For example, so one of the practices is pair programming. And he points out that, pair programming is absolutely worthless if you're only doing it because your boss says you're supposed to pair program. You go pair program. All right, fine, we'll pair program, like whatever. We don't believe in it. It's stupid, but you told us we have to do it. We're going to do it. What's really going to happen there is you're probably going to get half the work because people are pairing and they're not actually pair programming and using the values and principles of extreme programming and leveraging and holding that and sort of capturing that in their pair programming. They're just sitting next to each other and not really doing pair programming because they don't have the foundation and the right values. And one of the nice things also about values and a philosophy is that, the reality is you can't make enough rules to cover everything. Now, in 342, I've got a long list of sort of team behavior rules, and that's really to help us sort of make some things concrete for ourselves. In extreme programming, he hasn't done that, and instead he operates from, we've got these set of values. And from those values, you could derive all sorts of behavior rules, but basically his thing is to come back always to, as you're working, you're going to be thinking about, and it's going to be part of you that you hold these values to be true, and everything that you do is with respect to those values. And so we don't necessarily need explicit rules about how to behave because we know what our philosophy and our behavior and our values are. Much the way we hope that most of society would work. The downside is we can talk about all the values that we believe in society, but we still end up finding ourselves needing laws to make it really clear to people what is allowed and what is not allowed, and not just have society norms and morals and things like that. I think XP probably could do with a few more rules to guide people on some things, but let's talk about the values. All right. So the most important thing value-wise in XP is communication. And so Beck is telling us that if you want to have this isn't about a successful extreme programming team. What he's really getting at is if you want to have a successful software development team, communication is the most important thing. All right, and his notion here is, that there's always someone, for example, on the team who probably knows how to solve whatever problem is being faced. You working in isolation by yourself isn't really great. You should actually be communicating with people because you're going to find the solution faster. And I think you've probably done enough collaboration with other students to know that this is often the case, that a group of people can often solve things faster than individuals working alone. Now, one of the results of having really good communication is this idea that it's going to creates a sense of team and effective cooperation. So in other words, if we're going to be working together as a team well and cooperating, at its root is our communication. So he stresses that this is the most, so when we look at all of the principles and practices, one of the key things is going to be to have and improve our communication. Next up is the value of simplicity. And he calls this the most intellectually, or most intellectual, sorry, I gotta read this, the most intensely, it's not extreme, it's intense, most intensely intellectual of the XP values. And what is really he getting at here is, so what he likes to say to people is, when you're thinking, and this has a lot to do with how do you build the software. You want to build the simplest thing that solves the problem. The way he often asks, he'll ask someone when they're struggling is, what is the simplest thing that could possibly work? Now, he says a lot of people criticize this idea of simplicity as a value because they'll say, well, if we do that, then we won't have this. And he says, no, don't forget, that could possibly work. And so this is why it's this intellectual, mentally hard value to achieve, because you actually have to work really hard to come up with the simplest solution to the problem at hand. We can often come up with something more complex that solves, it takes a long time and is just a mess. But XP says you're supposed to be focusing on the simplest solution that you can come up with to the problem at hand. And that actually does take a lot of work. And it's something really to strive for. And one of his reasons for wanting to strive for simplicity is that the simpler the system is that you're able to build, the easier it's going to be for you to change it, expand it, build upon it, and so forth and so on. And so we want to stay simple in our solutions. The third value is feedback. All right. XP teams strive to generate as much feedback as they can handle as quickly as possible. So these teams, the idea is they're always working, on more feedback. And, there's feedback in terms of by the minute, by the hour, not by the week or the month. Okay. And this is feedback on all dimensions. You're going to get feedback from your customer. You're going to get feedback from your team. All right. There's going to be lots of software feedback from the testing that you're doing. One of the things XP is traditionally known for is often actually working side by side with customers on a frequent basis. So not like, oh, we meet with the customer once every week or once every 2 weeks, but having the customer or someone available to be answering and asking questions as people are working on things. His fourth thing is courage. Now this seems a little bit strange. He likes to call this, the definition is effective action in the face of fear. It sounds really good. Now, let's put this into actual meaning, though. And so this is things along the lines of courage to speak truths, even when these truths are unpleasant. So this points to we need courage to really maximize our communication. We can't be afraid to talk about certain things, mention certain things, be involved, to communicate. So there is certainly fear in so much of what we do, but it takes courage to overcome that. And one of the things is like, yeah, to point out what is the true state of things. We're not going to lie. We're not going to cover things up. It takes courage to do that. Another thing, courage to discard failing solutions. And seek new ones. Well, this is getting at the simplicity aspect. So you build something and you realize that's not really good. It's really not right. You have the courage to throw it away and build a new version. It's tough to do, but it's important if you're going to be really striving for that value of simplicity. Courage to seek real, concrete answers. And what he's getting at here is we're going to need this for feedback. We don't want a false illusion about our status, about how things are. We want to know what the customer really thinks. We want to know what the users think. We want to know what the real state of the software is. It takes courage to actually find out and see, yep, that's how many bugs we have. And we've got student teams here who seem hesitant, I'll admit, and I understand why, to actually have been like, oh, let's do our bug bash. I think part of the thing wasn't just the work that it's going to be and we don't want to do it, but it's the fear we're going to find lots of bugs. And once we find lots of bugs, that means we know that our software isn't as good as we hoped it was. And so, but it takes courage to dig in and get that feedback, to get that reality out. All right. The last value of extreme programming is respect. And the idea here is that it lies below the surface, as Beck says, of the other values. So if those values are going to work, respect is really key to that. We have to have it exist. And this translates quite simply, though, that teammates care about each other and the work they do, or the work that the team is doing. They care about the project. And so he's basically like, look, if you don't have respect for the people you're working with, caring about them, wanting them to succeed, as well as you care about the project you're working on, that you believe in it, the whole thing is doomed. Yeah. He has things, the contributions of each person on the team need to be respected. Absolutely. So each person is contributing something of value. We've talked about that. And I am important, and so are you. So you have to have your own ego, but you have to realize other people on the team are important as well. So those are the values of XP. Next, we'll talk about its principles.